The young mechanic laughed and shook his head. "Sir, with all due respect, you can't just walk in here and ask to touch a museum piece." The old man in the worn jacket didn't argue. He simply pointed at the M60 Patton sitting silent in the maintenance bay and said 7 words that would haunt that mechanic for years. "You're looking in the wrong place, son. If you believe that wisdom comes from experience, not credentials, comment respect right now." The National Museum of the Marine Corps had a problem. Their crown jewel, an M60A1 Patton tank that had seen action in Vietnam and later served as a training vehicle at Camp Pendleton, had been silent for 23 years. It sat in the restoration bay like a sleeping giant, beautiful in its olive drab paint and imposing in its 60-ton presence, but utterly, frustratingly dead. 3 generations of mechanics had tried to resurrect it. 3 generations had failed. The museum's director, a retired colonel named Patricia Hendricks, had made it her personal mission to get the tank running before the 50th anniversary celebration. She wanted visitors to hear it roar, to feel the ground shake, to understand viscerally what it meant to crew one of these machines in combat. She had allocated budget. She had brought in specialists. She had even consulted with General Dynamics, the tank's manufacturer. Nothing worked. The current team of mechanics, led by a confident 32-year-old named Staff Sergeant Ryan Mitchell, had been working on the M60 for 8 months. Mitchell was good at his job and knew it. He had restored 2 Shermans and a Stuart tank for private collectors, and he approached the M60 with the certainty of a man who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve. But the M60 had humbled him. Every diagnostic came back clean, every component tested within specifications, yet when they turned the key, nothing happened. Not a cough, not a sputter, just silence. On this particular Tuesday morning, Mitchell had called his team together to deliver the news he'd been dreading. "I've talked to Colonel Hendricks," he said, his voice flat with defeat. "We're recommending they source a different M60 from the reserves, one that actually runs. This one goes to the scrapyard for parts." His team nodded grimly. They had all reached the same conclusion independently. Sometimes machines simply died, and no amount of expertise could resurrect them. That was when the old man appeared in the doorway of the maintenance bay. No one had seen him approach. He simply materialized there, like a ghost from another era, wearing a faded field jacket that might have been green once, carrying a canvas messenger bag that had seen better decades. His hair was grey and cropped short in a style that hadn't been fashionable since the 70s. His hands were rough and scarred, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working with metal and machinery. Mitchell looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Sir, this area is restricted. Museums that way." He pointed toward the main building without really looking at the old man. "We're in the middle of something here." The old man didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the M60, studying it with an intensity that seemed almost personal. "She's not dead," he said quietly. "She's waiting." One of the younger mechanics snorted. Waiting for what? A miracle? The old man finally shifted his gaze from the tank to the young man who had spoken. There was no anger in his eyes, only a patience that seemed to stretch back decades. Waiting for someone who remembers how she speaks. Mitchell had dealt with his share of eccentric veterans who wandered into the museum and claimed special knowledge of the exhibits. He had learned to be polite but firm. "Sir, I appreciate your interest, but we've had every expert in the country look at this tank. Continental engineers, Marine Corps technical specialists, even the original manufacturer. Whatever's wrong with it, it's beyond repair." The old man walked past Mitchell as if he hadn't spoken, approaching the M60 with the familiarity of someone greeting an old friend. He placed his hand on the hull just above the driver's hatch and held it there for a long moment. Mitchell opened his mouth to object, but something stopped him. The way the old man touched the tank was different from how civilians touched it, different even from how mechanics touched it. It was the touch of someone who had lived inside that metal shell, who had trusted it with his life. 1968, the old man said, his voice distant. She was built in Lima, Ohio. Serial number indicates she was part of the 3rd production run of the A1 variant. Shipped to Vietnam in '69. Served with 1st Tank Battalion out of Da Nang. He turned to look at Mitchell. "I know this because I was her crew chief for 3 years. Mitchell exchanged glances with his team. They had heard similar claims before, veterans whose memories had blurred with time, who connected themselves to famous battles and legendary machines they had never actually touched. But something about this man's specificity gave Mitchell pause. "Sir, If you served on this tank, we'd have records. What's your name? The old man smiled slightly, the first real expression he had shown. Records get lost, files get misfiled, especially for crews that operated in areas that officially didn't exist. He moved around the tank, his hand trailing along the armour as if reading Braille. You've been looking at her engine, her transmission, her electrical systems. All the obvious places. That's your first mistake. The youngest mechanic, a corporal named Davis, who still had enthusiasm that hadn't been ground down by months of failure, stepped forward. What do you mean? Those are the systems that make it run. The old man shook his head. Those are the systems that make any tank run. But this isn't any tank. This is an M60A1 that served in Vietnam during the wet season. That changes everything. He climbed onto the tank with an agility that surprised everyone watching, given his apparent age. Within seconds, he had dropped through the commander's hatch and disappeared into the turret. Mitchell started to protest, but Colonel Hendricks had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. She held up a hand, signalling him to wait. For 3 minutes, the only sounds were metallic tapping and the old man's muffled voice counting to himself. Then he emerged from the hatch, holding something small and corroded in his hand. Here's your problem. He climbed down and handed the object to Mitchell. It was a valve, no larger than a thumb, green with oxidation and nearly unrecognizable. Mitchell studied it, confusion evident on his face. This isn't a standard component. I've never seen this in any manual. The old man nodded. You wouldn't have. It was a field modification. We called it the monsoon bypass. During the wet season, water would infiltrate the fuel system through the auxiliary intake. Factory design didn't account for it. Tanks were dying all over the country, so we improvised. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small notebook, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. This valve redirects fuel flow when moisture is detected, prevents hydrolocking. We installed them on every tank in the battalion. Word spread. Eventually, other units started requesting the modification. By 1971, it was standard practice. He opened the notebook to a specific page, covered in hand-drawn diagrams and precise technical notations. I wrote these instructions, sent them up the chain. Somewhere along the line, they became official doctrine. But the original documentation credited the Marine Corps Systems Command, not the field crews who actually invented it. Colonel Hendricks stepped forward, her expression sharp with interest. Are you saying this tank won't run because of a modification that was made 50 years ago? The old man shook his head. I'm saying this tank won't run because someone removed the modification 20 years ago, probably during a restoration attempt, not knowing what it was. Without the bypass, the fuel system is trying to process moisture that accumulated during storage. It's not a mechanical failure, it's a safety feature working exactly as designed, shutting down the engine to prevent damage. Mitchell felt his face flush with a mixture of embarrassment and dawning understanding. We drained the fuel system, multiple times, replaced all the filters. The old man looked at him with something like sympathy. Did you check the secondary reservoir, the one behind the turret basket? Mitchell's silence was answer enough. Without waiting for permission, the old man returned to the tank. This time, the mechanics followed, watching as he navigated the interior with the ease of someone moving through his childhood home. He directed them to a panel that wasn't in any technical manual, a modification that must have been made in the field and never officially documented. Behind it was a small reservoir, and inside that reservoir was water that had been sitting for 2 decades, slowly corroding everything it touched. Drain this, the old man said. Replace the seals. Fabricate a new bypass valve using these specifications. He handed the notebook to Mitchell. And she'll run. She's been wanting to run. She just needed someone who remembered her secrets. 4 hours later, the M60's Continental AVDS 1790 engine coughed, sputtered, and roared to life for the first time in 23 years. The sound was deafening in the enclosed maintenance bay, a thunderous declaration that the old warrior still had fight left in her. Colonel Hendricks stood with tears in her eyes. Mitchell stood with his mouth open, and the old man stood with his hand on the hull, feeling the vibration of an engine he had kept alive through 3 years of combat and 50 years of memory. Colonel Hendricks approached him as the engine settled into a steady idle. I need to know who you are. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a laminated card, faded but still legible. It was a military identification card from 1972, bearing a photograph of a young man with intense eyes and the name Master Gunnery Sergeant William Cross, 1st Tank Battalion, FMF. Hendricks took the card with hands that trembled slightly. Master Guns Cross. I've heard that name before. She looked up at him. You wrote the M60 Field Maintenance Bible, the unofficial one that every tank crew in Vietnam used because the official manuals were worthless in actual combat conditions. The old man, William Cross, shrugged. I wrote what needed to be written, others took credit. That's how things worked. Hendricks pulled out her phone and made a call. Within 30 minutes, the maintenance bay was filled with people. The museum's senior curator arrived with historical records that confirmed Cross's service. A representative from the Marine Corps History Division arrived with questions about field modifications that had never been properly documented. A reporter from the Marine Corps Times arrived, having been tipped off by someone who understood the significance of what was happening. And through it all, William Cross sat on an ammunition crate beside the idling M60, answering questions with the same quiet precision he had used to diagnose the tank's problems. He had been homeless for 6 years, he explained without self-pity. His wife had passed. His pension, due to a bureaucratic error that had never been corrected, had been reduced to almost nothing. He had tried to fight it, but fighting paperwork required resources he didn't have, so he had adapted and survived, the same way he had adapted and survived in the jungles of Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Mitchell approached him during a lull in the interviews. He stood at attention, something he hadn't done for anyone below the rank of general in years. Master Guns, he said, using the honorific that Cross had earned decades ago. I owe you an apology. I dismissed you. I assumed I knew more than you because I had newer training and shinier tools. Cross looked up at the younger man and shook his head. You have good instincts, good training too. What you didn't have was context. That's not a failure. That's just experience you haven't lived yet. Mitchell struggled with his next words. The things you know about this tank, about field modifications, about keeping these machines alive in conditions they were never designed for, that knowledge is going to die if it's not passed on. We're losing veterans every day who carried information in their heads that never made it into any official record. Cross considered this for a long moment. What are you suggesting? Mitchell looked at Colonel Hendricks, who nodded encouragingly. We want to offer you a position, lead advisor for the restoration team, part-time, full-time, whatever works for you. Housing assistance through the Veteran Support Program, a chance to make sure everything you know gets documented properly this time. For the first time since he had appeared in the doorway that morning, William Cross looked uncertain. The offer represented everything he had lost and given up hope of recovering. A purpose, a community, recognition not for glory but for genuine contribution. I'm 78 years old, he said quietly. I sleep under bridges and eat at shelters. I haven't held a real job in 15 years. Mitchell didn't hesitate. Master Gunnery Sergeant, you just fixed in 3 minutes what 23 years of experts couldn't touch. Your age is an asset. Your experience is irreplaceable, and where you sleep doesn't change what you know. Cross was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the M60 that was still idling in the bay, its engine a steady heartbeat that he had first heard in 1969. Then he stood, straightened his worn jacket and extended his hand. I'll need proper tools, and access to the archives, and someone to type because my handwriting's gotten worse over the years. Mitchell grasped his hand firmly. Done. All of it. The following month saw a transformation that extended far beyond the maintenance bay. William Cross became a fixture at the museum, arriving each morning at 0600 with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years answering to military time. He documented modifications that had saved lives and had never been officially recorded. He trained young mechanics in techniques that couldn't be learned from manuals. He sat with visiting veterans and listened to their stories, helping them connect their memories to the machines that had carried them through the worst moments of their lives. The M60 ran in the 50th anniversary celebration, its engine roaring for crowds who had never heard that sound before. Cross rode in the commander's cupola, straight-backed and clear-eyed, wearing his dress blues for the first time in decades. When the parade ended and the crowds dispersed, he remained beside the tank answering questions from anyone who approached. A young Marine, barely 19, asked him what it was like to serve on one of these machines in combat. Cross thought for a moment before answering. Loud, he said, hot, terrifying, and the best years of my life because I was surrounded by people who would die for me, and knew I'd do the same for them. The tank was just metal. What made it special was the souls inside it. The museum created a permanent exhibit in his honour, not a monument to him personally, but a documentation of the field innovations that crews like his had developed under fire. The exhibit included his original notebook, now preserved under glass, alongside the stories of other mechanics and crew chiefs who had kept the machines running through improvisation and ingenuity. Cross insisted that their names be included. "I just wrote things down," he said. "They figured things out, that's the story that matters." He served as lead advisor for 4 years, until his health no longer allowed him to make the daily trip. Even then, he continued consulting by phone, answering questions about vehicles he had serviced half a century earlier, with a memory that remained razor-sharp despite everything else that had faded. When he passed away peacefully at 82, surrounded by the young mechanics he had trained, the museum lowered its flags and ran the M61 final time in his honour. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, now a gunnery sergeant and head of the restoration programme, delivered the eulogy at a ceremony attended by hundreds. Master Guns Cross spent 50 years carrying knowledge that the Marine Corps had forgotten it needed, he said. When we found him, we thought we were doing him a favour. We were wrong. He was doing us a favour. He was giving us back a part of our history that we had almost lost forever. The manuals he wrote, the techniques he preserved, the standards he set, those will outlive all of us. That's what legacy means. Not monuments, not medals, just making sure that the people who come after you are better prepared than you were. The M60 sits in the museum today, fully operational, a testament to what happens when knowledge and humility meet. Beside it is a plaque bearing Cross's photograph and a simple inscription. Some things can't be learned from manuals, some teachers can't be replaced. Master Gunnery Sergeant William Cross reminded us that experience is the most valuable tool in any mechanic's kit. Never dismiss someone because they don't match your expectations. The vagrant at your door might carry answers to questions you didn't know how to ask. Knowledge doesn't care about appearances. Neither does excellence. If this story reminded you that wisdom deserves respect regardless of where it comes from, subscribe to this channel. We share the stories of those who served, those who sacrificed, and those who deserve to be remembered. Their knowledge is our inheritance.